All right, guys, so we're trucking on, right? And we have now almost came full-bodied with the mass spectrometer. We've kind of talked about all the pieces and parts that make this thing work. And as I told you before in the very beginning, it's going to be a little bit more complicated than UV and infrared and AA. Now, something else that we need to talk about before we go anymore. I keep talking about the fragment. So here is the molecule. It goes through the electron beam. Excuse me. And a couple of things begin to happen. One is I get the molecule that carries a positive charge that has just lost a tooth. Or two, I get part of the molecule that has a positive charge as well. Notice, though, that I just kept writing one positive charge. Okay? Positive ones. It loses one electron. I've never really done anything different than that. Okay? So in the mass spectroscopy world, the issue is that we typically get confused, and that's because this is never mentioned. But I'm going to mention it to you because that's the type of person I am. See how much I care about you? So these fragments travel down this tunnel, and they hit the collector plate in the very end, and they get registered. And I kept saying that these are the formula weights of the compounds. Well, they are. But they don't really call that formula weight on the mass spectrum. So on the mass spectrum, the x-axis down here, we always refer to as formula weight, but we are referring to it wrong. And I don't want to lie to you like everybody else does. So we need to have a serious conversation about what really goes on that x-axis. And it's something that we call M to Z. The M to Z ratio. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, this is prim and proper. And you're going to quickly see that we're going to go back to formula weight after I introduce this concept. And that's specifically for a reason. Well, the M here stands for mass. And the Z is going to stand for charge. So what happens is that the collector plate registers a mass to charge ratio. It does not register formula weight. Well, this is the mass of the fragment. Yes, that's true. I didn't lie to you about that. And then this is the charge of the fragment that came through. Most of the time, though, the charge that we're talking about is going to be a positive 1. So as the collector plate hits, it's going to take the mass, let's say 72, and it will divide by the charge of that fragment, which will mainly be a positive 1 every time, and 72 divided by 1 is 72. So in effect, it is the formula weight of the fragment that got registered, which is why we always refer to these x-axis in the spectrum as the formula weights. That is why that happens, but here's the catch. All of this relies on the electron beam. This is another reason that we do 70 electron volts. Because if we slam it with too much energy, not only do we increase the fragmentation pattern, but we also might increase the chances of getting a positive 2 instead of a positive 1. That means that if this fragment weighed 50 and it ventures down the quadrupole and it hits the collector plate, this collector plate is going to register 50, but it's also going to register that positive 2 charge, and 50 divided by 2 is going to be 25. And this 25 is what will show up on the mass spectrum. And for us, we are going to assume that that fragment weighed 25, when actually it didn't weigh 25. It weighed 50. Because that's really not formula weight on the bottom. It's really a mass to charge ratio on the bottom. That is where it starts to conflict everything. So, another reason for 70 is to control the positive ones that come from the electron chamber. We want those to be positive ones. We do not want positive 2s involved, because that begins to change our whole concept of what this x-axis really means. Research and development, great. Go for it. Have fun. But as far as databases, laboratory processing, we want things to stay consistent at a positive 1 charge, and we want to control this aspect. So that is what we call M to Z ratio, which is really the unit that is on the x-axis. If I give you a test question and I say, what's the unit on the x-axis? Do not give me formula weight. That's actually wrong. We're simplifying it. The unit that goes on the x-axis is M to Z, mass to charge. Yeah. I know it does eventually lead to formula weight, and they're the same number, but to be proper, it is M to Z that shows up on the x-axis every single time. So make sure you use that as an answer to a test question. Now, recording the spectrum. We have 2 options here. The first option is what we would call a normal mass spectrum. This is really what we've talked about the entire time. You know, we have M to Z or formula weight down here at the bottom, and then we will get basically lines everywhere. And what we're doing is that we're looking at complete fragmentation here. That's option number 1. Complete fragmentation. We look at all. We look at the whole piece that goes through. We look at all the pieces that it breaks up into. We take all of that information in consideration. There we go. That is what we would call the normal mass spectrum that we will always see and that we will start out analyzing. However, we do have a second option that will make my job a little bit easier here, and this is called a fragmentation pattern or a fragmentation spectrum. They get these 2 things confused, all right? And the reason is because some people would say, well, this is fragmentation pattern, right? I mean, I'm looking at fragments here. So why isn't this called fragmentation spectrum? Well, it is. Those are fragments, which is now why we don't really like to use this term anymore. Fragmentation spectrum was something that was used very, very early on in the mass spec field. There's still some people that refer to it. There's still some people that will use that term, but we've gotten away from that term to make these 2 things a little bit clearer. So now what we call this is SIM mode. And SIM stands for selective ion mode. So I guess I don't need that second mode there. That would sound silly. Selective ion mode. So SIM is a selective ion mode. It will actually go through and allow you to pick just one fragment, or maybe more than one fragment that you want to look at. You don't need the whole picture. You don't need all fragments across the board. I want you to go back and take a look at the PFTBA here. And in that tuning file, up at the very top left-hand corner, you saw 3 fragments that it was very particular with. Those 3 fragments were analyzed using SIM, selective ion. You selectively told it, only look at these 3 fragments and that is it. I don't want you to look at anything else. Well, the MS actually did the whole spectrum down below. That way, if you needed it, you could have it. But the SIM allowed you to get larger, more detailed representation of what's happening at these three areas that were very important to you. So that's what SIM is. All right? So there's a couple of laboratories that would use SIM. These typically, the SIM method is typically used for very low concentrations of stuff. It's also used for species work. Speciation is what we would call that. So for instance, let's say I'm looking for a chlorinated compound. That chlorinated compound is slightly different from another chlorinated compound, but their mass spectra is going to be different. Instead of looking at the entire MS mode, I can look for just that one fragment that's going to be different and use that one fragment as an identifier. All right, that's another kind of opportunity for me to use SIM. But there's tons more out there. And again, it just really depends on the method that you're doing. Up on the y-axis, this is typically abundance. We've mentioned this before, so I'm going to mention it again. So this is how often are they showing up. So I could have one that's a really tall one that's a little bit taller, and then maybe this one in the front, that's the shortest one of them all. At least of the major fragments that I'm seeing here. Okay, so with that said, we need to maybe take a look at some mass spectra in the next video. And we need to go through and we need to start identifying bits and pieces and parts of everything that begins to go on. Before we do that, though, I just kind of want to review one more piece that we should not forget about, and that's going to be our vacuums. Everything has to be under a vacuum here, right? If we want fragmentation spectrum, or if we want to look at SIM, and we want to get the fragments that we're seeing here in the mass spec, we have to make sure that, yes, everything has to go through the tunnel. Yes, everything has to go out the other end. It has to turn that curve. It has to hit the collector plate. But we have to get rid of all the trash. We need to talk about where that trash goes. And here you go. So we've mentioned this before, but we said that this thing has to be under vacuum, right? So vacuum right up there at the very top. And the purpose of the vacuum, I said, was to create a vacuum, yes. And why do we have to create a vacuum? Well, number one, we have to make sure that these particles, these fragments that we're creating, does not slam with air particles, because that's going to prevent them from reaching out the other end. So we've got to get rid of everything out of there. It's got to be a complete vacuum or at least close to it. And that's what requires us to pump it down and really have it pumping for a week before we begin to use it. Notice down here at the very bottom, there's going to be two pumps that create the vacuum system. One is going to be called the main pump, but we don't really use the word main pump. We use the turbo pump as the identifier for that. That turbo pump is really inside of the instrument for the most part. This turbo pump does have a lifespan. We've had to replace our turbo pump already, and this is about a $5,000 replacement. The turbo pump will go down no matter what you do with it. It's going to go bad. Even if you don't use it, it will actually go bad, believe it or not. It's like a rusty bicycle. The longer you let it sit, the more rust it's going to get. So it's going to be harder to start it back up and harder to get it to do what it needs to do. If it's running, though, it's wearing out pieces and parts. So as it's wearing out pieces and parts, you're going to have to replace it. So you're going to have to replace it, no matter if you use it. Who cares? They got you. $5,000 check coming their way. So the turbo molecular pump really is the pump that kind of takes all of that stuff out of the machine, and it never sees the daylight of the detector at all. However, there is what we would call a rotary pump attached to that as well. This is kind of a preliminary pump before the turbo molecular pump. So the rotary pump is the one that you can actually see. This thing actually has some oil. You have to replace that oil. You'll have to fill it up. You'll have to change it out over a course of time. and you will see this pump typically sitting down below the instrument. You'll physically see it, and you will physically hear it. So what you're hearing cut on when the machine is on, and what you see down below, is what we would call the rotary pump. That rotary pump is pretty okay. I mean, it's going to have a pretty long lifespan. As long as you take care of the oil, change it out, you're not going to have a problem. The issue here is the turbomolecular pump. That's the pump that's going to be pricey. That's the pump that you can't really get into without those specialized tools to take the cases and stuff off the mass spectrometer. And that's typically what you would have to call a Shimadzu representative or some other kind of field instrumentation installer out to your company to really replace and maintain that part. We also have these things called preventative maintenance contracts. We call them PMs. And that PM, or preventative maintenance, will allow Shimadzu or another instrumentation company to send out a representative once a year typically, and they just take a look at your equipment. They replace a few parts on it. That's about it. Nothing more than that. And they just make sure that it's looking good and that nothing really weird or off the wall is beginning to happen with your instrument. They typically will replace some common consumables over the course of that program or preventive maintenance that you have. That way, you are paying for service, but you're also paying for a little bit of the consumables as well. So, turbomolecular pump, it's going to happen. It's just a matter of time. But that's the purpose of the pumps. But there are two of them, a rotary pump and then the main turbomolecular pump that gets it to do its job. So on the screen here, what you're seeing is kind of more details about what each one of these will do. So this is the rotary pump. This is what you would change, and this is what you would see. It removes the exhaust from the turbo pump area, and the oil should be changed. If you're running this thing every day, the recommended here is about every 3 months. You want to make sure that the oil is drained from it and new oil goes in. It's kind of like changing the oil on your car, right? Every 3,000 miles or so, you want new oil to go in. The same thing's going to happen here with the rotary pump that sits down below. The turbomolecular pump is the one typically on the inside of the instrument, a little bit more hidden. That is the main pump. And that pump removes everything from the MS system. If it wasn't for the turbomolecular pump, the rotary pump cannot do that. The turbomolecular pump is the one that does it. The blades turn at 60,000 RPMs. So rotations per minute. So every minute we're getting 60,000 full rotations or spins out of this thing. And the lifespan is anywhere between 3 to 5 years. For us, we're on the 5-year mark. The 5-year mark has already came. We've already had to replace that turbo pump. But listen, we don't run it every day, right? But I know that I just told you that even if you don't run it, it's still going to go bad. Yes, that is true, but we run very clean samples. We're not running trash and dirt through it. We're running it for a couple of months out of a year. That's about it. But at the 5-year mark, we've had to replace that turbomolecular pump. So we're on the kind of fringe of the longevity. We're right at the 5-year mark, and I'm sure that many companies would love to have 5 years out of their turbomolecular pump, and they are suckered with a $5,000 repair bill every 3 years or so. So that's the difference between the rotary and the turbomolecular pump, and those are kind of the details about each one of them. Here's another picture of high vacuum versus low vacuum. Notice that in the high vacuum up here at the very top, it says the mean free path for the high vacuum is longer than the distance between the ion source and the detector. And then down here at the bottom, the low vacuum, the mean free path for low vacuum is shorter than the distance between the ion source and the detector. All of this is saying is that we are removing the junk. Remove the junk out of the system because we want our little positive piece to zoom down through this tunnel and go out the other end without getting interrupted. it doesn't want to be bothered. All right, the same thing's happening here. There's less particle on the inside. Think of these as like air particles and stuff. We want to get rid of it. We want everything out of there. And low or high vacuum or low pressure, right? Low pressure basically means that these things can go through and out the other end. Okay, that's what we're after. So on the software system, what you typically will see is a vacuum setting. And this vacuum setting will need to be pumped down close to 0 pascals. That's the pressure unit that we typically will see on software systems. And the closer it is to 0, the better your vacuum is going to be. So that's what we're after. And you'll see a little green meter that sits right beside of the vacuum. As long as the vacuum shows green, then that means it is happy with the pressure that it has. It's happy with the vacuum that's present. But if that meter goes yellow or red, then we have an issue. That means the turbomolecular pump cannot do its job the proper way. It's not creating a high enough vacuum that you can run your samples on and feel good about the data. So that's a meter that we always want to take a look at. It's also a meter that's very important because it gives me an idea about when this turbomolecular pump is causing me a problem or will cause me a problem in the future. All right, so with that said, I'm going to stop this video. In the next one, we'll talk more about fragmentation patterns, and we might actually start looking at our first bits and pieces of a mass spectrum now that we know how these things are getting generated.